So welcome everyone to this Thursday evening Dharma talk at Mountain Cloud, the sixth Thursday of this year. A cycle of weeks as the moon orbits the earth about once a month, and the earth orbits our sun about once a year. We tend to see this cycle as linear, a measure of time, the turning of cause and effect, even of life and death. But our practice, this practice, invites another way of seeing, springing from immediate experience, from now. Not a progression, as though we live in some gap between before and after, but a circle without the slightest gap. Whole, indivisible, and each moment, all of it. Dogen speaks to this circle as the all-inclusive fact of our practice in this famous passage that begins a two-part chapter, really, in the Shobogenzo called Continuous Practice. Many of you will know this, but it was in the air, so here it is, Dogen. On the great road of Buddha ancestors, there is always unsurpassable practice, continuous and sustained. It forms the circle of the way and is never cut off. Between aspiration, practice, enlightenment, and nirvana, there is not a moment's gap. Continuous practice is the circle of the way. This being so, continuous practice is undivided, not forced by you or others. The power of this continuous practice confirms you as well as others. It means your practice affects the entire earth and the entire sky in the 10 directions, although not noticed by others or by yourself. It is so. So for the past week, we've been focusing on the theme for this season of practice at Mount Cloud, beginner's mind. 30 days of Zen with Kirin is now underway. Last night I spoke to this, attitude or mode of practice. We have these wonderful casual wisdom Wednesdays that Will and Scott, sometimes Bill Bruce and I kind of rotate. We circle through. So beginner's mind, this shin, free of concepts and assumptions, innocent, no basis for comparing or for judgment. The 0 point of this very moment. All time now. All turning now. At the end of that short informal talk last night, Scott asked, what do we do when we fall out of beginner's mind? Dogen says that's not possible. You are beginner's mind. And yet, we begin again and again and again. 10,000 times beginning. The circle of the way. About a year ago, a student who had finished, we say, all the koans, gone through this whole long koan curriculum one time. She found herself drawn to the image of a circle. This circle, the moon, actually in all its phases. An enzo, like the beautiful one we have here, the entryway. The circle of the hand gesture of Miroko Bosatsu, this Bodhisattva Maitreya, this zero, complete. The student has now spent a year revisiting koans that involve a circle. There are a number of them, monks and masters drawing a circle, sitting in the middle of a circle, circling the dice. And about a year ago, this student had the chance to offer a first Dharma talk, first talk. As she began with the question, where do I begin? Of course, completely natural. First talk, all that practice, where do I begin? But in that question is also, where do I begin? Who am I really? What is Zazen? What is this? What is the origin of Mu? So now, this wonderful student is preparing for a second talk a year later. And she recently shared her notes with me. Not a manuscript or a list, but a big piece of paper with a circle sketched on it. And along the perimeter, all around, these smaller circles drawn like planets orbiting the empty space, the middle of this circle, or bubbles, each one with a little cluster of notes. And the last bubble, this question, where do I begin? No gap, one continuous circle, continuous practice. The past 2 weeks in our last 2 Thursday night talks, I've taken up 2 turning words by Haryo, this master, Pailing, a Dharma successor of Unman, Yunmen. The first turning word, doesn't matter if you heard it or not, but Haryo's first turning word, just 2 lines. What is the Deva sect? What is the Deva school? Or What is Zen? What am I? Heaping snow in a silver bowl. We took that up and it snowed that night. And then, second turning word, what is the way? A clearly enlightened monk falls into the well. So tonight, by way of coming full circle, I like to turn to Haryo's third turning word. It's short, like the others. Full circle because this is the end of what's known as the miscellaneous koans in Sambo Zen. And it's also the last case, case 100 in the Hekigonroku, or Blue Cliff Record. There, the case is called Haryo's sharpest sword, or sometimes Haryo and the sharpest sword. Here's the case. A monk asked Haryo, "What is the sharpest sword?" Haryo said, "Each coral branch reflects the moon." Sometimes it's each branch of coral reflects the moon, or a drop of dew on each branch of coral reflects the moon. So I've already said a bit about Haryo, Bailing, this disciple of Unman, how when it came time for the transmission ceremony, instead of accepting the emblems of transmission, sort of scrolls of calligraphy that would, present his line, instead he offered Unman these three turning words. And as the story goes, it's documented various places. Unman was so pleased that he asked his disciples, I don't want a memorial service when I die. Just have Haryo give a talk on these three turning words. So here is this third one at the very end of the Hekigonroku, Blue Cliff Record. Teisho compiled it. He's a fourth generation disciple of Unman. So it said he was about 40 or 42 when he did this. And he was born about 30 years after Unman died. So, not 100 years later, he put these together. Like Unman, Teisho was known for his literary talent, and so he composed a verse to go with each case. There's a record that on beginning and finishing each verse that he wrote, Teisho did deep prostrations and offered incense to the altar. I was reminded of this today, and it brought up a passage that I remember reading a while ago. I went looking for it. It's about this more modern Soto master, now gone, but Koban Chino. And he told a story about himself dropping to the floor, weeping in uncontrollable grief. when, as a child, he received the news of his father's death. And then, the record says, when he rose to his feet, both he and the world seemed irrevocably changed. I think of bowing that way, he said. Koban Chino said. You go down, and when you come back up again, you're a different person. What about our simple bow? To the altar, the computer, the faces on the screen, to one another, this one gesture. The circle, the 0 point. Where do I begin? A cutting question, if you really ask it to the full. And that's how Haryo asks, or how his monk asks on our behalf. What is the sharpest sword? What cuts through all our delusion, our constructions? What extinguishes our concepts? Any sense of I am here and the world is out there. The blind, lonely, phantom conviction of separation. In, out, high, low, good, bad, self, other. What cuts to the quick of the knot we imagine as binding us? Lack or excess, the grip of knowing and of suffering what we think we know. I was sitting with this today, and I flashed on something that Scott shared from his psychotherapy a long time ago, from psychology. This line, I'll be okay as soon as this never happened to me. Bless our hearts. Things happen. Sometimes horrific. Sometimes redemptive. Where do I begin? What is the sharpest sword? Not too long ago, I came across reading or hearing the word alone. Resounds through this practice, alone. And what I heard instead was all one. Just that little flip. That little flip. Shakyamuni Buddha, sitting. And out of the depths of his practice, the open space, the boundlessness of that one heart, seeing the morning star and exclaiming, top of heaven to the bottom of the earth, alone, I alone, but that I is completely swallowed. Where do I begin? Just one shining. One. And gone. What is this emptiness? This sharpest sword, so sharp nothing can survive it. What is it? It's you. Here, And you're sitting, listening, bowing, standing, walking. Sometimes called the hair-blown sword. And it's just this. The sword that admits nothing but this. Cuts through any trace of separation and includes everything. Alone, all one. And this immense capacity, the virtue, the tradition says, of who you truly are. So what does that sharpest sword, this true nature, do with past and present, cause and effect, life and death? Again, the tradition says it cuts the two into one. What is that sharpest sword? What are you? Haryo doesn't need many words. He just says, each coral branch reflects the moon. Each coral branch. So where do we find those coral branches? What about this cutting? This table, this floor, the hum of the audio system, the light of the screen, each bit perfectly cut out, perfectly cutting. It's such a marvel. Just this. Here's the moon. So how then is it that we hold on to the notion, I'm not endowed with this, not able to see, as if that's decided? It's just a defense, a little gap. And even that is also it. Somehow, even in our reluctance or hesitation, we know this fundamental reality, this original face, calls to us. Who and what we truly are draws us to the sword of this practice, the circle, the 0 point, your own true heart, this one heart. There's a very famous koan by Unman that comes up just about every time any koan comes up somehow. Comes up every time we watch the news. The koan is every day is a good day. But rather than go into that, I just wanted to read a poem by a student by that title that seems to respond to this sharpest sword. to this moon everywhere you turn. Here's the poem. So now you've seen the empty field, the one in which wars are fought and bombs are dropped, and we get cancer, and parents die, and children die, and we lose our memories forever, and species go extinct. So what will you do now? Be the field in which it all arises, and weep, and pray, and witness, and help, and love. Each branch of coral is the moon. Yamada Konroshi asks, what is it that remains when the self is forgotten? And he goes on to forget the self is a scary thing. Even though the fact is that there isn't any self and we've just created the idea that it exists. What remains when the self is forgotten? Everything. He goes on, the whole universe remains, but there's no longer a barrier between you and it. Past, present, and future, the entirety of the 10,000 things is what remains. Each branch of it. And then he says, but talking about it doesn't reach it. It must be realized directly. That sword. So I'm going to close with a little poem from Rilke that a very dear friend of ours sent. We trade poems. And this one is called, Not to be Cut Off. Not to be cut off. Not through the slightest partition, shut out from the law of the stars. The inner, what is it? If not intensified sky, hurled through with birds and deep with the winds of homecoming. The winds of homecoming, this full circle, right here. Secho's verse to the case ends with a line, after all of this, he says, there is something else. Each coral branch reflects the moon. Thank you all for this shared practice.